market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua, live at the Munich Security Conference, and this year's meeting takes place amid the backdrop of mounting instability and escalating conflicts, with leaders navigating a new world order. Delegates here, including dozens of heads of state and government, will discuss topics ranging from the future of the transatlantic relationship to the security implications of AI and technology. Now, our guests this hour include the Polish Foreign Minister, the PIMCO Vice Chair, Amundi's Head of Geopolitics, and the Executive Director of the Aspen Security Forum. Now, modern militaries are increasingly leveraging big data and artificial intelligence to gain a tactical edge over adversaries. Palantir sits at the center of this shift, maintaining expansive defense contracts with the U.S. and allied governments. But it's not without its controversies. It has faced criticism for its role in President Trump's deportation of immigrants through its contracts with ICE. Well, Shon Manasco, Palantir's international defense lead, joins us now. Shon, thank you so much for joining us. I want to get onto the ICE contracts and whether this has an impact of negotiations. Do other customers around the world ask you about it?
Really, they don't ask us too much about that, and certainly it's been in the news. But as it turns out, we've had a long-standing relationship through multiple administrations with the Department of Homeland Security. And I don't want to get ahead of them, but I would say that that work is, I know, important to many people, and we're excited to continue to do what we can and work with democratically elected leaders and administrations, and I foresee that happening into the future.
Can you talk specifically about the UK when, some lawmakers actually say, we're worried about using Palantir technology in some of our NHS drives or actually government drives. Do you go and speak to them, and what do you tell them to reassure them that it can be used as a force for good?
Yeah, they don't talk to us directly about that, although I wish sometimes that they would. I would say that the work that we are doing in the U.S. And the technologies that are being employed, much like they're being employed on the modern battlefield, like in, say, for instance, Ukraine, is really important. And that's where I spend most of my time, is with militaries around the Western world and trying to employ our software to help them.
What do you see actually then on the battlefield? Again, we often talk about some of these contracts, in AI, in defense, being used at scale, but they're not yet. We're just at the beginning.
Yeah, we are just at the beginning, but the Ukraine crisis has taught us a lot. And there have been a lot of lessons that we've been able to glean from our work in that conflict. And as it turns out, I think many nations are struggling with this idea of can we internalize those lessons and deploy them to our forces? Some are further along in that journey than others, but as it turns out, in the modern battlefield, if you don't leverage the right and very best technology, leverage data at scale, and bring it to bear for your men and women who are in uniform, you're destined to be not in a advantageous position. And so I'm excited about the strength of our conversations with many countries. But I would say I would love for that to be even more. And our work with NATO is an example of an affirmation of the technology actually works, and we can deploy it very quickly.
Shon, I mean, when you speak to people in government, they say they want the best technology, but they're worried about confidentiality. They're worried about giving out some of the data. So again, right. Is there a way of getting encrypted data so that you analyze it without, for example, the Department of Defense giving away everything to a tech company?
Absolutely, and we've done this for many, many years in Europe. And this idea of sovereignty, I know, means different things to different people. But if the data, the software is deployed in your data centers, you control it, it's administered by those sovereign entities, really those conversations don't go anywhere other than to say, I understand that I maintain the sovereignty, so you can move data safely and securely and seamlessly leveraging the software itself.
Is there a barrier to, not terror, but is there a barrier that would actually mean it'd be much easier to scale up? So is it encryption or is it something else?
It's not really that. It's really more about compute. And so having access to the very best chips and the very best servers so that you can actually keep up with the modern pace of warfare is really what is the most important thing. And the limitation for some countries as they try to actually posture themselves and the alliance, right, to provide the maximum amount of deterrence that they can.
I mean, some of your values are, and you say this openly, I think one of your logos is pro-democracy. How do you marry that with also working for governments that maybe don't uphold democratic standards that we see in our eyes?
Yeah, it's a great question. We made the decision very early on that we would only work with democratic and Western type allies who really share the same common view of the world that we do in the Western hemisphere, so to speak. And so what I would say is that that particular stance that we have taken prevents us from ever doing business with countries that don't share the same values as Western nations. And so we have never done business in Russia. We've never done business in China, as an example, nor will we in the future.
But is there, I mean, not a danger, but actually the worlds and alliances are changing. So it's a bit of a fuzzy concept these days.
Yeah, that's why it's really, I think, interesting that we're here in Munich at this conference, because these are like-minded nations that come together and really work to strengthen partnerships and alliances such that we can provide the best level of deterrence that we possibly can. And that's where our energy is, and that's where our focus is, and that's where these countries are asking us to spend time with them to understand how they can employ the technology so that they can be contributors to the overall NATO alliance. And so I'm encouraged by that. I hope that this conference will be a reinvigoration of the collective good that we can do by working together.
Shon, I mean, warfare on the battlefield is changing quite a lot. So again, you're giving the ability to computers then to decide, or to robots or drones to decide whether to kill or not. Like, how ethically do you think about that?
Well, it's a topic that we spend a lot of time with nations discussing. But the reality is we think there has to be a human in the loop. That is in stark contrast, though, some of those countries that wish to do us harm, who are more than willing to let an AI agent talk to an AI agent to actually deliver a kinetic strike. And that's not what we do with our software. That's not what we encourage the nations that we work with to do. But I do think that that's going to begin to change over the course of time. And who knows, having a person in the loop may, in fact, just be the person who's actually entering in the prompts to, for instance, a large language model or some other type of AI agent.
So you don't see it going agent to agent? Because it feels like that's the direction that we're looking at.
Yeah, I think it's really important that there is a human involved and in the loop as those agents work together before, in fact, there is some type of kinetic strike. And so that's what we believe is the case. But again, the adversary, though, that we are up against will actually try to let those agents just deliver the kinetic action themselves. And so what we have to figure out is how can we make sure that our decision cycles are so quick to compete with that reality.
Right. And you have to be on the field. I mean, even as a foreign correspondent, I was always told that you have to also trust the team on the ground to make the decision. So if you have someone at central command making that call, it may not be the right one.
Yeah, it could be that I wore a uniform at one point in my life, and so I appreciate the person on the ground who's got the best perspective. But also there are things that are happening at different echelons that they may or may not know. And so the idea is, how can you take what's happening at the strategic and operational level and bring that down to the tactical level so that they can make the very best decisions to defend themselves in the territory that they're looking to try to defend.
Shon, are you surprised how fast this technology is advancing, or is it actually slower than you thought 5 years ago?
Given the threat, I would say that it needs to be moving even faster, although it is moving at quite an aggressive pace. And I really credit NATO and SHAPE for taking the technology and deploying it. We've been doing that for the last year. And so it is beginning to build momentum. The question, I think, for us collectively is it fast enough in light of the threats that we all face, especially here in Europe?
But how do you stop bad actors from actually engaging, like some of your software?
So our software is very, very secure, and there's a reason why we've had such a long-standing relationship with many countries here in Europe. And so they understand and they can control, again, back to sovereignty.
Yeah.
If they can control who has access to it, who administers the systems themselves, which they do, then they can sleep well at night knowing that there are no bad actors in the systems themselves.
What are you expecting at Munich Security Conference? I imagine you're also meeting with clients. Do you think a lot of the conversations will be around, well, you're an American tech company, can we trust you?
Right. Well, what I hope to be engaging in conversations about is how can we deploy a set of tools today that helps our men and women who wear a uniform do what they need to do to defend themselves. And so this idea of needing to be able to fight tonight is very, very an important concept. And so those men and women deserve the very best hardware and software so that they can do the jobs that they have signed up to do.
I mean, has the war in Ukraine actually, again, changed your perspective as a former military?
Very much so. It's certainly a lot more deadly and lethal and faster than I ever had experienced when I wore a uniform. And so that speed is what really drives the need for you to have the very best software so that you can actually make the most of the individual weapon systems that you employ, because you have to be able to do that in time and space so that you can actually deliver the outcome that you're looking for. So, like I said, we've been there from the very beginning. We've learned countless lessons that we're then beginning to take to other countries that we partner with. Not only countries, but also companies that we partner with, both here in Europe and in abroad.
Yeah. I mean, you see you see more stuff than most of us when it comes to modern warfare. What keeps you up at night?
Well, we should all be very concerned about swarming drones. We should all be concerned about the ability for our adversaries to produce these munitions very quickly and at low cost. And so this idea of having affordable munitions that you can manufacture very quickly and actually deploy is so important. And that's where I would say the more countries actually take advantage of dual-use type technologies like ours, the better they're going to be able to actually push capabilities forward to the tactical edge to defend themselves.
Shon, thank you so much for joining us. That was Shon Manasco, Palantir's international defense lead. Now, coming up, we'll talk to John Studzinski, Vice Chair of PIMCO, also Senior Advisor to MSC, and Anya Rosenberg from the Amundi Investment Institute. We'll talk about the impact of geopolitical events on global markets, but also, of course, on world affairs. That's next, and this is Bloomberg.
Earnings season is here.
Let's get back to the earnings story.
Get all the details that you're going to need to start the trade.
Bloomberg is first to break the numbers.
A bunch of earnings. Pretty agricole.
Earnings from Heineken, ABN AMRO reporting as well.
Fantastic reporting from you and the team.
With the smartest insights.
We've delivered, again, record results.
If we take a step back and look at the yearly results, the income is stable.
Our earnings interviews continue. Lots of really contrasting conversations.
Continuing coverage on Bloomberg.
The conversations that matter, the insights you need. This is The Pulse, and I'm Francine Lacqua, here live at the Munich Security Conference. Now, beyond world leaders, of course, the Munich Security Conference draws finance executives seeking a front row seat to how geopolitical shifts will disrupt global markets. Well, John Studzinski, Vice Chairman of PIMCO, is no exception, except he's also a Senior Advisor at MSC, and he joins me alongside Anya Rosenberg, Head of Geopolitics at the Amundi Investment Institute. So thank you both for joining us. Anna and John. John, let me start with you. When you look at MSC, I mean, last year was a bit of a shell shock for a lot of leaders, where we had the Vice President, J.D. Vance, showing up saying, look, Europe is not doing enough. Are we expecting anything different from the U.S. administration this year?
Well, Munich Security Conference is celebrating its 62nd anniversary. And, you know, it's one of the original creations of Henry Kissinger. And I think it's really come into its own in terms of becoming a global focal point. We're expecting a very powerful speech from Chancellor Merz later today. I know he's expected, the Security Council wanted him to give a short speech, and he's in fact going to give a long speech. So I think he's going to try to cover a lot of the ground. The whole focal point certainly in the last 2 or 3 days has been Europe trying to reassess its role in the world. And that was obviously triggered by the Mark Carney very, very clever speech. Mark's not here, sadly, but I think his presence, he's the elephant in the room here. He's here more than ever. So I think this year, in fact, is going to be a year where Europe is going to be ready to talk about how it's going to re-engage and actually reestablish its legitimacy in the world.
And it's true, Anna. I mean, that Mark Carney speech in Davos was almost, you know, was a real call to middle powers to come together and kind of be like a force for good. I don't know if the middle powers of Europe were actually listened or are stepping up to the challenge.
Well, I think I've been coming to the MSC now for about 4 years, and what you can tell is that I think the first year there was the Russia-Ukraine war had just started, and there was still the feeling that Ukraine could win this. So there was a lot of enthusiasm about that. The next year, there was a realization that that wasn't going to be the case. The third year, we had the Vance speech. And I think now we're in this position where, okay, we have to kind of go this alone to some degree. And to me, the question is, how good is Europe going to be at that? Are we going to hear more optimism this year? Ability to kind of implement some of the reforms that we had in the Draghi report, etc. The security, the defense issues. The challenge that we have is that Europe is one of the middle powers that is completely dependent on its security from the US. And I do not think that that's going to change, because it is not in the US geostrategic interest to really let us loose and do our own thing. We will always remain dependent on US security.
But I mean, this is, you hear a lot of leaders trying to get away from that, or actually strengthen the European powers. This is complicated by US and China. What is the right way for Europe to look at China, John? How do you see? I mean, there's so many global forces that could come all at once that make the situation very complicated.
You couldn't have two countries more different than America and China. And right now, the Chinese know where America's coming from. They don't really know where America's going. And I think what's happening is, remember, China functions on a 5-year model, and they've had 15 5-year plans. They look at long-term investing, they look at long-term infrastructure, long-term strategy. They've been ahead of the game on power, ahead of the game on data and digital infrastructure. They are hanging back and quietly developing transactional relationships across the globe, and strengthening their relationships, not just in the global south, which they talk about, but strengthening those relationships in Europe.
Anna, do you worry about, something that we haven't thought about, the biggest risk that is unpredictable? Because we talk a lot about Taiwan, we talk about U.S. foreign policy. There's so much concern about everything. I wonder whether we're focusing on the wrong things in time.
Well, I think the risks are clear most of the time. The one thing that I worry about, and that we don't really know the answer to, is how is the AI race really going to develop? Where is it going to leave middle powers? Are we going to be fully exposed to the US, totally exposed to China? What's the position we're finding ourselves in, especially in Europe? Because right now we do not have much leverage in that space. And to me, that is something I worry about, because if this new world order, and however the AI revolution is going to play out, we haven't found our footing. And we need to find a space as Europeans to have companies that can also create leverage in this geopolitical new normal that we are in.
What do you think the new world order looks like? Are we already in it, John?
No, I think you're in an incredible state of transition. And, I've spent a lot of time where, given my PIMCO role, I spend a lot of time with the biggest pools of capital. The pools of capital in the world are, the major ones, many of them are decoupling. They're not decoupling. We talk about decoupling, but they're not decoupling from America. They're de-risking from America. And de-risking isn't about anti-Americanism, it's about pro-resilience. And it really is about pro-resilience. And I think when we look at Europe, we look at I've had fascinating conversations with Europe, and I think you might see out of the 27 countries, Francine, you're going to see a group of them becoming very nimble, very fast-footed. The Nordic region is particularly impressive. You've seen the Danes and the Swedes. They want to play at the global lead in quantum. You just had a panel a few minutes ago on Bloomberg on quantum. Yeah. You see them being much more on the front foot on NATO and defense. We have a lot of capital-raising initiatives right now for defense funds, defense infrastructure. The German government is setting aside a lot of money for this. So Europe is, ironically, it has the whole European defense budget is half the U.S. defense budget. The U.S. defense budget this year is going to be approximately $1 trillion. The European defense budget at the moment is about $500 billion. But actually, when you look at the size of the armies, the manpower, the European army manpower, arguably they may not be as well trained, according to the Americans, but they almost double in size. So Europe is going to try to reestablish its legitimacy. And remember, as Henry Kissinger always said, to function in the world, you have to have legitimacy and power. And Europe now has to get the power side in the respect mode. And that's what they're going to work on in the next 5 years. But it's going to take 5 years or 10 years before they actually do that. And that's the period, this interregnum, where the relationship with America, the security relationship with America, is going to be very, very important.
Yeah. But, I mean, to your point, it can be much more difficult if you don't have big tech companies in Europe. It's much more difficult if you also need to work on competitiveness in European economies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of political constraints that we still have. And I think there is now political momentum. There is an understanding that things need to change. The question is, how much space is there for change? Because we have, ultimately quite a lot of struggling political leaders in many countries. And usually, geopolitics depends on local politics. Yeah. Everything moves up from there. So if someone is constrained by local politics, that limits their ability to act on the global stage. And the challenge that Europe has limited geopolitical power because we do not currently have the power in this world, in this new world that we are in. You have power if you have nuclear weapons, strong militaries, and if others depend on you, basically natural resources. And Europe has one big advantage, which is we have a lot of soft power. And I think that's something that you have seen come to fruition now with the EU-India trade deal, the EU-Mercosur trade deal. Europe is diversifying, as you were saying. It's de-risking from the US. And I think we're going to see it muddle through. But I agree with John that a real paradigm shift will take a few years.
John, what have we learned about U.S. foreign policy since the beginning of the year? There's been Venezuela. We're waiting for something maybe in Iran, but the underlying, thread is what?
Transactionalism. And it's funny because you couple a word of transaction, which sounds economic-driven, with ism, which sounds like it's a foreign policy. And it's not just, I know Ian Bremmer talks about the Don Road Doctrine, but I think this American foreign policy, and there's an emerging discussion, and I think you have a panel here, we have a panel here, about the new American exceptionalism. Mm-hmm. People talked about American exceptionalism dying. The new American exceptionalism is, what is its role going to be in the world on the foreign policy side? Trying to actually not be a policeman, but probably play a role in trying to bridge economic interests with political stability.
I mean, I guess the concern is that if it's always about transactions, then you don't have an unwavering ally.
Well, I mean, shouldn't be taken for granted anyway. But I think we have seen one remarkable consistency in U.S. foreign policy over the last year, which may seem contradictory, but it is that American presidents come and go, but U.S. core interests always stay. And when you want to look at one constraining factor for this current administration, it is those core U.S. interests. So talk about walking away from NATO, walking away from Ukraine, walking away from Europe, even not really supporting Taiwan. That is not what we see in the real actions. If you look at the national security strategy, if you look at the new defense law that was passed, there is still a lot of support for allies. It's clear that the U.S. needs Europe, needs NATO as an ally, because it's a key advantage compared to Russia and China. So I think, and as a result also, by the way, we see the US has to continue to be interventionist, because it is part of the US core interest to be. So if you want to look at foreign policy moving forward, look at US foreign policy in the back.
So we have a number of speeches here. John, what are you most looking forward to? So the Chancellor, the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, kicks us off, and then is it the Chinese foreign minister or someone else?
Well, I think you're going to hear a lot of very articulating views from the President of Finland, the Prime Minister of Denmark, Mette Frederiksen. I think I'm looking forward to hearing a lot of the middle power voices emerge, because I think they are going to take a bigger and bigger leadership role in Europe. And I think those voices are going to be driving some of the themes about the future in terms of, and remember, capital chases credibility. And if these voices sound clear and strong, that's going to strengthen the capital flows into the European model.
So interesting. John and Anna, thank you both for joining us. Anna Rosenberg, Head of Geopolitics at the Amundi Investment Institute, and John Studzinski, Vice Chair of PIMCO. Coming up, as Russia's war on Ukraine heads towards its 5th year, world leaders gather here in Munich, and we'll be speaking to Radosław Sikorski, the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs and Deputy PM. That's next on Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here at the Munich Security Conference. Now, this year's Munich Security Report has described the current era as one of a wrecking ball politics. It says sweeping destruction is the order of the day, and as a result, more than 80 years after construction began, the U.S.-led post-1945 international order is now under destruction. With us now, Chad Thomas, Bloomberg's executive editor for Europe, and Jennifer Welch, chief geoeconomics analyst at Bloomberg Economics. So thank you both for joining us. I'll get into your fantastic report that you're basically, showing the world here at Munich Security Conference. Chad, you always have the best and hardest job of getting everyone together to work to try and break some news here at Munich Security Conference. Like, what are we watching out for? What are you looking out for?
Well, I think, as we always are at these big events like this, Francine, when we're there together, we're looking for that moment, that thing that comes as a big surprise. Last year, of course, we had J.D. Vance here, and he dropped a bombshell speech that people just weren't expecting because it wasn't really about the security conference ultimately. And so we'll be watching to see, what does Marco Rubio, he's giving the speech for the U.S. this year, what does he have to say? We hear from sources that's probably going to be more traditional, more in sort of the defense space, but it's really at this moment as we're kicking off, waiting to see, is there going to be a moment that everybody's talking about later in the day?
Jennifer, I love, this is what Bloomberg does best, is basically you put numbers and analysis into what people are afraid of, right, which is conflicts, new conflicts, old conflicts, current conflicts. So talk to us about this report and actually what you found the most surprising in putting it together.
Well, keeping in line with the theme of the destruction of the international order, we tried to put a cost on what that destruction would look like by estimating the cost of conflict across these 7 hotspots, from the Taiwan Strait to NATO's eastern flank. And the highlight is it's much bigger than most would imagine. A conflict over Taiwan, we estimate, would cost about $10 trillion to the global economy. That's almost 10% of global GDP, more than the cost of the pandemic or the COVID. And I think when you take a look at just the economic cost, it really rounds out the consequences for the global economy. Really, no major economy will be unscathed by this. And that really isn't part of the conversation here in Europe, not just about Russia, not just about the transatlantic relationship, but also Asia.
It's a great report that we're also pushing out on social media. Chad, I mean, there's this idea that, middle powers kind of rallied by that Mark Carney speech in Davos will come together. Is that what we're going to hear today? Are we going to hear fighting talk? Or is Europe kind of just going to lay low and see what the Americans say?
Well, I think, we have the German Chancellor, of course, we're in Germany, speaking this afternoon, and we hear that he will really lay out his vision for Europe today and sort of the defense of Europe. So that will be something we'll be watching for closely. Of course, there are many meetings today regarding Ukraine, and we have the Ukrainian President Zelensky here. So we'll be watching to see, is there any movement on that front? We're not honestly expecting there to be big movement, but there was one person saying today, these things happen in drips and drips and drips until you have a waterfall.
Yeah, but thank you both. I know you'll both be very busy, so good luck for the rest of the conference. Chad Thomas, Bloomberg's executive editor for Europe, Jennifer Welch, chief geoeconomics analyst at Bloomberg Economics. So under President Donald Trump, the world's largest economy has retreated from global initiatives amid a backlash against globalization. Ajay Banga, the World Bank president, says multilateralism still has a role to play despite the pressure on many international organizations that were established after the Second World War. Every day someone says multilateralism is dead.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
No. Because during the last year or two, when things were really tough, IDA 21 happened. We got to raise money every 3 years for that part of the bank that goes to 78 poorest countries. Because we give away 1/3 of the money every year without repayment. So it kind of runs out, even though we are profitable and the rest of the bank runs on its own. But this one requires recapitalization. During this entire period, we recapitalized IDA 21, that is the campaign, at a record level, higher than ever earlier. And that was during the time period that the Japanese government changed, the German government changed, the French government changed a couple of times, the British government changed, the American government changed, the Canadian government changed, the Korean government declared martial law on the day of our event in Seoul. So even with political turmoil, there is a role for multilateralism. The question is, what kind of multilateralism aimed for what? And that, I think, is the issue.
And so how has it changed? This is what public money that gets married also with private money.
Yes, absolutely. So that's a really important point, that you will find that fiscal constraints exist everywhere in the world. The developed world has its own issues. Yep. And therefore, relying on handouts is not going to work. I really believe in any case that handouts have a low outcome probability, and that you have to find a way to incent people to use the money they're getting, to use it for better. It's not that you don't need some handouts, but you do need, that's grants, but you do need as well the incentive to use that money to make things happen. And I think the private sector and private capital mobilization combined with the money you can get from the public sector, combined with philanthropy, that's a good combination to work with.
Well, you can watch the full interview with the World Bank Group President Ajay Banga on Leaders with Francine Lacqua. That's today at 5:30 p.m. in the UK, 7 p.m. Eastern in the US. You can also stream it on Bloomberg Originals, and you can watch it on the Bloomberg website. Now, we're here at the Munich Security Conference. It's, of course, been a big day and a big year when it comes to foreign policy. Ukraine set to receive as much as $35 billion in new military aid from allies to strengthen its air defenses. Now, this comes after a series of massive Russian airstrikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure and civilian targets. Russian aggression remains one of the biggest topics here at MSC as U.S.-led negotiations on peace continue without a breakthrough. Well, I'm delighted to now be joined by Radosław Sikorski, Poland's Minister of Foreign Affairs and Deputy Prime Minister. Minister, thank you so much for joining us. Mark Carney was talking about these middle powers. What does that mean for Poland? How is Poland organizing itself in this new world order?
Well, we think that Western Europe spent too long consuming the peace dividend after the end of the Cold War. We've been spending 2% for 20 years. We're now at 4.8% because even though Russian capabilities are not what we thought, they can't win in Donbass, but their intentions are much worse. So we need to modernize by the end of the decade, and then I think we'll be ready to deter Putin.
I mean, how do you see the relationship with the U.S.? Do you think this transatlantic partnership is broken to a point of no return?
It's going to be different. I just met Secretary Colby from the Pentagon. The U.S. presence in Europe will remain, but in a more limited, more strategically focused way. And we Europeans need to stand up land forces. Germany changed its constitution in order to do that. I told you about Poland. Others need to just to do what they have pledged to do at successive NATO summits.
Minister, when you say the relationship is different, I mean, is it transactional? Is it based on business instead of allyship?
It was always based somewhat on business. Just read the Washington Treaty. It's about economic collaboration, cross-investment, and all that. Look, in the past, when you've been in these jobs for almost 20 years, you've seen a lot. On the European side, promises were made to the United States that were not always kept. And so there is now greater frankness in telling us that we need to do more. And I think we should get serious.
What are you expecting as the main message from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, when he shows up? I mean, last year was a bit of a cold shower, frankly, hearing the Vice President, J.D. Vance, talk about Europe.
And it wasn't about defense. This is a security conference. It was more ideological. I would like the conference to firm up our resolve to sustain Ukraine in the fight. If Putin managed to conquer Ukraine, Europe's strategic position would worsen, and we would have to spend more on defense. It's cheaper to sustain Ukraine in the fight.
Do you think there's as much resolve as 6 months ago in supporting Ukraine?
The U.S. is no longer paying for its deliveries to Ukraine. We Europeans are. that gives us the right to have a voice in the arrangements and the outcomes. We've pledged, we've already spent over 200 billion euros. We've pledged another 90, which should be enough for Ukraine for 2 years. But if we chipped in some more, Ukraine has capacities unused in their own defense sector. We could then change Putin's calculus so that he recognizes his criminal mistake.
But, Mr. Is Europe actually involved enough? I mean, we also hear about negotiations that don't involve Europe in ending the war in Ukraine. Like, how does that make you feel, and how does Europe get something at the table?
That it's getting a little strange, that we pay for the war, and yet we don't even always have the full information. So this is where the US, on the other hand, could recalibrate.
Thanks to what? European resolve? Does Europe need to be more forceful?
We are spending real money, whereas the US is actually making money on this war. You know, we're buying US weapons for Ukraine.
Yeah, there's been sanctions packages under sanctions packages against Russia. Are they really making a difference?
Yes, they are. Russia lost the most lucrative markets for its oil and gas. This clunker fleet is increasingly expensive. And India is ceasing to buy Russian oil. They're having to overpay for components and give discounts for gas that they send to China. The Russian National Reserve Fund is almost empty. They're beginning to sell their oil reserves, gold reserves, which is their last reserve.
But does that make Russia more desperate, or does it make the conflict shorter?
Well, wars end in all kinds of ways. World War I ended when Germany ran out of resources. Yeah. And Russia is beginning to run out of resources of all kinds.
You've known Secretary Rubio for years. Will you meet with him?
Yes, it's planned. I mean, it's a moving feast, as you know. But, of course. But we are planning to talk here.
Will he give you reassurances of the role that the U.S., at least, from a moral perspective, can help?
Well, our president was in the White House last year, and President Trump promised that there would be no reductions in Poland, and the Pentagon confirms that. So we think that U.S. presence in Poland, at least, which means that we're protecting the Western Europe, that will continue.
Minister, how do you look at technology? So we had a good conversation with, the defense lead at Palantir. It seems that Europe just also doesn't have really, technological AI defense capabilities. Do you think that's coming? Are they going to be organized? Is there sovereign concerns?
Well, the SAFE mechanism, 150 billion euros, certainly in the Polish allocation, will be favoring cyber security and those kind of capabilities. But yes, I mean, 300 billion of Europeans' pensioners' money goes every year to the United States to feed their entrepreneurial economy. We need to complete the single market. We need a banking union. We need a capital markets union. We need to spend more of our money in Europe.
But what do you think the problem is? That heads of states in Europe are weak, that they don't have the right mandate, that is too short term?
It's constitutional. We are a confederation. The United States started as a confederation, and then they went on to constitution, and they became a federal state. So our problem is that which is desirable is politically difficult because we are so fragmented.
But so will anything change? And actually, if Europe says we need to wake up, we need to be stronger. You talk about capital markets union. I mean, we've been waiting that for like most of my lifetime.
Organizations and countries reform themselves only when it's almost too late, and it is almost too late now.
Minister, what are you expecting at Munich Security Conference? What would make a good Munich Security Conference from your perspective?
What I want to hear is from our American friends and allies is where we want to be in this relationship in 5 or 10 years' time.
And where do you want that relationship to be?
We'll hear from Marco Rubio.
From Secretary Rubio. Just a final question on Ukraine. How do you expect? I know it's a very difficult and impossible question, but what do you think the steps in terms of time frame will be this year to bringing peace? Does it just drag on, or
despite Russia's cognitive warfare on us, Ukraine is not losing this war, is imposing huge costs on Russia, and Putin should make a deal before it's too late. But of course, when you're a dictator, people lie to you. You don't have you have rose-tinted glasses, and so he thinks he can still conquer Ukraine. He cannot.
Minister, thank you so much. Radosław Sikorski, their Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs and Deputy Prime Minister. Now, coming up, we'll have plenty more, of course, from the Munich Security Conference, how policies favoring destruction over reform are gathering momentum across Western societies. We'll discuss the new era of so-called bulldozer politics. More on that next, and this is Bloomberg. The conversations that matter, the insights you need. This is The Pulse, and I'm Francine Lacqua, live at the Munich Security Conference. Now, we've heard from data giant Palantir on the tech outlook. We've just spoken to the Polish foreign minister. Now, let's explore where U.S. foreign policy might go from here. With us now, Anya Manuel, executive director of the Aspen Strategy Group and a former official at the U.S. State Department. And, of course, you all know John Micklethwait, Bloomberg's editor-in-chief. So thank you both for joining us. John, let's start with you. I mean, this is a kind of an odd Munich Security Conference, because last year we had J.D. Vance basically telling ideologically the Europeans that they were doing things wrong. Are we going to hear from Marco Rubio in a more friendly or ally-like way?
It's all odd for me because it's the first time I've been. But in general, I think Rubio will probably do it in a slightly kinder, nicer way. But the underlying message will be the same. You know, we want you to arm up. Rubio's also a big apostle of focusing quite hard on the Americas. And we have an interesting piece this morning looking at the voyage that Rubio has been on from this sort of neoconservative past towards which, and neoconservatives believe very firmly in the idea that America is there to defend freedom, to project the West, and it's not about cozying up to dictators like Vladimir Putin. But he has managed to find an accommodation with Donald Trump, and that's been an interesting voyage to watch.
Anya, what's your take on some of the biggest risks out there? There are many. Is there something that we're not seeing?
Well, I think we're seeing them all. The Munich Security Conference always covers the waterfront. I'm surprised. I've been here for a day and a half, and there's been very little discussion so far of China, because I think there's so much about the U.S.-European relationship that isn't as close, as you just mentioned, as it was. There's a lot of focus on the Western Hemisphere. Great. But I still see China as one of the biggest problems. I mean, when you see what's happening in the Taiwan Strait, what's seen with the increasing exercises around Taiwan and in the South China Sea, it's relentless, and it's not getting any better.
I agree, but in a slightly different way. I think that there's this sort of subtext going on with the Europeans. Mark Carney was due to come here as well. You had Starmer going to see Xi Jinping. You've had Carney going there. You've had this element of the Europeans sort of slightly reaching out to China, and there's a very interesting sort of backstory to that I think at the moment Americans in a post-Trump world will probably forgive them a bit. They'll say, well, that Trump was pushing you in that direction. But at some point, I don't see very much Anya says. I think America's main focus will always be China. And the more that the Europeans cozy up to the Chinese, the more they run the risk of causing problems like that. And I think there is a sort of subtext there. It's not on the main stages, but behind the scenes, you see people arguing about that.
Well, and you just wonder how much of it is for show and how much of it is real realignment with China. And I tend to think that it's mostly window dressing at this point to say we have alternatives.
But Anya, I mean, I guess from a defense point of view, there's now question marks on whether if China were to invade Taiwan, whether the U.S. would do anything about them, if there was some kind of commercial deal on the side.
Yeah.
I mean, could this be a reality?
Well, it's interesting. Actually, when you read the national security strategy and the national defense strategy of the United States, they're very clear. And on China, it's sort of right down the line. It sounds very little different from what you've had in previous administrations. Now, there were a lot of China hawks who were in this current Trump administration, and they've been managed out. But I don't see from the Pentagon things really looking much different. Certainly from Indo-PACOM, when you talk to our commanders in the field, they see things like they've seen things for the past decade. I think that's positive.
Does Europe, John, have to choose between China and the U.S., or can they play both fields?
I still think in the end it's a very simple choice that they have to stick with the U.S., but I think they're flirting rather obviously in order to get things. I think the most interesting bit really possibly is tech. I think the one bit where the U.S. defense establishment are worried and you can certainly see the technology people are worried, was the decision to give these much quicker chips to China. Back in Davos, I interviewed the head of Anthropic, who said that was the equivalent to giving nuclear weapons to North Korea. It is, it will help the Chinese that much, and so you have this problem where, on the one hand, Trump is at least manifestly taking on China, but behind the scenes, he's always willing to do these transactional deals. And you suspect that in the meeting between him and Xi Jinping, it's probably going to be Xi Jinping who's going to come out of it with the bigger gains again.
It does feel like U.S. foreign policy is just very transactional. And so I don't know whether, again, the Venn diagram of things that could happen has gotten much wider.
With the Chinese, I mean, you do have this moment. This happens always in the lead up to a presidential summit, but you have this moment now where both the Chinese and the Americans are trying to keep a lid on it. Yeah. And Scott Bessent is in charge of this upcoming summit between Xi and President Trump, and there is kind of an instruction to not upset the apple cart. Yeah. Now, I don't know if that means more chips, fewer chips. I have to tell you, I was in China just before the holidays, and the AI diffusion is unbelievable. The robotics are unbelievable. I was in a southern province where you just have mountain and mountain and mountain covered with solar panels that are powering all the data centers. So this tech competition is real, and I don't think we should let up.
John, there's a lot of noise about Europe decoupling from the U.S., or rechanging that relationship. Like, how do you see it going forward?
I think the answer is it is happening in a small way. You look even at a country like Britain, as I said, Starmer went to China. Britain is discussing sort of more nuclear tie-ups with the French. It's more obviously trying to do things with the Europeans, not so much to abandon the Americans, but to give itself options. And if again on the subject of tech, if you're running kind of big parts of the British defence industry or intelligence or any of those sort of areas, you are now in a situation where Trump has pushed it so far that you have at least in principle to look a bit at other tech sources in the same way as Britain famously got into bed with Huawei and then got out very quickly. I think it's not quite the same with America, but there's definitely an element of looking at different options. And the reason why is people are having to think about this thing strategically. And these are decisions that last for a very long time.
What do you think is the way forward for Europe?
Well, it's funny, as someone who lives in Silicon Valley, who works with our tech companies all the time, this makes me really sad because, of course, the companies think they're reliable partners, they're good partners, they want Europe to they want everyone to build what their competitive edge is. They don't want to take over everything. Yeah. But the idea that you're now going to have a European sovereign cloud, that you're going to have home-built things, it'll just create inefficiencies that nobody needs.
There's this problem with the tech companies, I think, throughout politics, that people in different countries are getting cross with the tech companies, but in Europe you've got this added sort of anti-American thing because for the simple reason the Americans are leading that part, although I completely agree with Anya. All the evidence is that yes, the Americans are winning kind of white-collar AI, they're winning ChatGPT, Anthropic, Gemini coming up very, very quickly against ChatGPT. But when you look at things like robotics, manufacturing, everything to do with energy, the Chinese are winning there.
But so what does that mean? I mean, it's also the first time, I think, in human history where you have this huge technological change in the hands of private companies.
You do.
How does that make you think of this differently?
It makes me think that our government needs to, all our governments, U.S. and European, can no longer abdicate the responsibility to regulate. I mean, if you look at the Chinese, they have some things that are draconian, but some of their AI regulation is just common sense. How do you not displace people? How do you not have deep fakes? And we're not seeing any of the real discussion, certainly in the U.S., and I see in Europe sometimes overreach and sometimes not enough. It's just time to have a real societal conversation about this.
My guess is that the way into it will be through children, weirdly. I think you look at the debates about phones and schools and all those things, and the fact that the tech companies in some places are overstepping. We have a film called Can't Look Away that details in quite horrible graphic detail children who commit suicide. Because of the way the algorithms lead them. That I think, politically, that is the underbelly of these otherwise very, very powerful people, and I think you're going to see a backlash in America. But outside America, it's going to be fueled also by nationalism, because people are not happy about the fact that all these big companies are American.
Right.
Anya, in 20 seconds, do you see actually MSC changing to, its defense and AI? That really has to be part of the conversation on security.
I think it's done a great job. They're doing a lot more on tech. We had a great conversation just now about the agents are out. I mean, as of last week, OpenClaw is all anyone can talk about where I live, and you're already seeing these enormous attacks, agentic attacks on banking systems, on crypto, and so we have entered the brave new world. And I'm glad we're talking about it here.
Thank you both for joining us. I know it's just a start. We have like another 3 days of conversations. Shon Micklethwait, Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, Anya Manuel, executive director of the Aspen Strategy Group. Now, our coverage from the Munich Security Conference, of course, continues throughout the day. We're just getting started here on Bloomberg. The U.S. Senator Tom Tillis joins surveillance at 1:15 p.m. London time. That's 2:15 Munich time. Up next, Bloomberg Brief, and this is Bloomberg.